Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our monthly Strengthening Families Networking webinar. I should actually say good morning and good afternoon because even some of our presenters are in a time zone where it's still morning at this point. This is, of course, a national webinar. We always appreciate everyone joining us. I'm Kaylin O'Connor from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and I'm going to lead us through what we'll be covering today. I will share some updates from CSSP, and then we'll have our main presentation, which is from Shirley Pitts and Tammy Sandoval about Strengthening Families Alaska and the work that they've been doing there. We will then have our updates from the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds from Martha Reeder and Meryl Levine. Those of you who participate in these webinars regularly know this is a little off our usual schedule, but we're doing this to accommodate different schedules and to have a little bit of extra time for some of the information that folks from the Alliance wanted to share. So we will dive back in. I'm hearing some background noise, so I think one of our presenters may need to hit mute, and I will keep moving along. So just a little word about these webinars for those who might be new. We send out an open invitation to anyone who's using the Protective Factors Framework or coordinating Strengthening Families efforts, whether that's in a state or a program or an agency. We work together to convene these between my organization, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and our colleagues at the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds. Each month we coordinate a specific topic with guest speakers, and we are always welcoming volunteers to share some of the work that you're doing. We can typically match you up with someone from another state who's doing similar work or find a way to share the work that you're doing. So let me know if you are interested in that. And the Alliance maintains a page, actually a Google page, that has recordings and materials from years worth of these webinars. So I encourage you to check that out if you ever miss it, or if you remember that there was one you really liked and you want to scroll through and check out those PowerPoint slides and recordings to see what you might have missed. One thing I wanted to mention is that you should be able to get an announcement about these webinars in the Strengthening Families e-update newsletter. Sometimes that ends up going into people's spam accounts, or your email address changes and you stop getting them. You can always go to cssp.org, and on any of our pages, click on the Stay Connected button. Put your email address in and click on that button, and you'll be able to select from all of our newsletters. So you can get the Strengthening Families one. You can also get our Early Childhood Learning and Innovation Network for communities. You can get news about race equity. You can get news about child welfare system reform. So I encourage you to check that out and make sure you are getting our newsletters so that you find out about these webinars each month and about other exciting news. Okay, so the webinars that we have coming up, we do this on the second Thursday of each month. And exactly 4 weeks from today, on March 9th, we're going to hear about mini grants to support Strengthening Families implementation in West Virginia. So I'm excited to get to hear about that information. Jeanette Rousey and Jim McKay from West Virginia will be sharing that. Jeanette shared when they did the first round of mini grants almost 3 years ago, I believe. And now we'll hear about sort of what 3 rounds of these process has taught them and what kind of activities and effects they're seeing. And then mark your calendars for April 13th, May 11th, and June 8th, always the second Thursday of the month, and you'll find out the topic as we go. A couple of webinar tips. If you are having trouble dialing in, for example, you might just switch to computer mic and speakers, which can then come directly through your computer, or the other way around. If you're having trouble with the sound on your computer, switch to dialing in. You do need to, in your panel, tell GoToWebinar which way you're connecting. And if it gives you an audio pin when you're dialing in, put that in so we know who's who and we can unmute you if you have a question you'd like to ask. If you do have problems, type it into the chat box, and Martha and I will be keeping an eye on those and trying to help people as much as we can with the technology. Take comfort that if you are having trouble with the technology, we are recording this and you can access it later if you need to, if it's just not working. And do use that questions feature and let us know. Either you can raise your hand and tell us that you'd like to speak and we'll unmute you, or you can just type something in and we'll read it off. So I just have a couple of updates I want to share from the CSSP side. One is that Anna Lovejoy and I are going to do a webinar next week, actually this time next week, for the Preschool Development Grants Technical Assistance Community of Practice, which is a federal technical assistance group. These are aimed at people who are implementing with the preschool development grants, but they are open to anyone. And many of you who are on this call already know Strengthening Families really well, but there may be people who are newer to your leadership team or who have never gotten a basic intro. And if they are in the field of early care and education, this could be a really useful webinar for you to let them know about. We'll be covering the basics of what Strengthening Families looks like in early care and education programs. We'll talk about the everyday actions that teachers can take and that programs can put in place. And we'll talk about concrete steps for each of our core functions of Strengthening Families implementation. I think it will be a nice overview for that early care and education focus. So if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and register. You can also find the most recent e-update and forward that to people who you think might be interested, because all the information is in that newsletter as well. And one of my colleagues recently did a webinar that many of you might find interesting, also for the Preschool Development Grants Technical Assistance Community of Practice. But this was focused on addressing poverty, promoting opportunity, and advancing equity in early childhood. These are all issues that are very critical to our work at CSSP, and I think very critical for many of you. So you might benefit from listening to the recording of that webinar, or at least viewing the slides that Melanie prepared for it. And I'd encourage you to check that out. Again, that was in our last newsletter, or you can grab the link from here. So those are all the updates I'm actually going to share. I'm very excited to introduce some of our great and long-standing state leads, Shirley Pitts and Tammy Sandoval, both from the state of Alaska. And they've been doing really innovative work. They're going to share some of the history of how they've worked. And I will point out that Shirley officially retired, but continues on in this capacity of with her passion for helping families build protective factors. And I'm just so glad that we didn't lose her from the Strengthening Families world when she retired. And I know Tammy's glad for that too. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Shirley and Tammy.
Good morning. Thank you, Kaylin. Well, let me start by saying that we're really thrilled to have this opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing in Alaska with our American Indian and Alaska Native population. And as Kaylin mentioned, I'm no longer with the state of Alaska, and so I'm serving as a consultant. And I basically work for Tammy, who's the director of our Child Welfare Academy that provides all of the training for our child welfare workers, as well as taking the lead on some of our Strengthening Families work now. So anyway, we're very pleased to be here. I am in Juneau this morning, and Tammy's in Anchorage. So I never know what might happen at this end since I'm not in my office. So Tammy and I will, she'll pick up if I drop off or if I get a big noisy background where I'm stationed today. So I'm going to start out. Tammy can join in whenever, and she will also talk to you a little bit later. So just this, the first slide, the picture that I had up there of Mount McKinley, as most of you have probably known that to be, is, you know, what our mountain that we're famous for here. And I wanted to show that this morning for a couple of reasons. One is because we're very proud of Alaska and we think it's a beautiful state, but we continue to make progress with recognizing our Native populations in Alaska. And most recently, before President Obama left office, he has allowed the federal government now to go back to calling this mountain Denali, which was the original Indian name for the mountain. And so if you live here, you've been calling it Denali for a long time, but now we can formally do that federally also. So we continue to make little bits of progress. And the other thing I would say about Alaska that's a little bit different in terms of how we're organized from other states, we do not have counties in Alaska. We have a couple of boroughs, but we basically have a state-to-local relationship, and we have a state-to-tribe relationship. So we have about 225 communities, small communities in Alaska, and most of those, almost all of those in rural Alaska, are considered tribes. So we have 225 tribes, and they're organized under 13 regional corporations. So when you want to do something systematic in Alaska, you're dealing with 13 different systems plus the state, and so that always makes implementation sort of an interesting thing. So that's just some background information about strengthening families. Next slide is really, I wanted to give you a little bit of history. As many of you probably on the line today, we started as a pilot site back in 2005. And that was very exciting for us, and we were delighted to be chosen. And we began by developing a leadership team, as most states did, and what we tried to do is bring as many systems into that as possible so we could infuse strengthening families sort of across the state. We started early with our early care and learning programs. That was our focus, again, like many states did. And you know, rationale for that was that's where we know families are already showing up. And it's starting with early childhood, and what we knew about brain development really pointed us in that direction. But because of that focus, we tend, most of our work was done in our urban areas, our larger communities that had child care centers or preschools, which many of our rural locations don't have. And I just kind of wanted to highlight a little bit of our process to show you how structured we were sort of in the beginning and kind of how we're approaching this with our rural populations now. So when we focused on our early care and learning programs, we developed a real strong partnership with our Child Care Resource and Referral Agency. And where that eventually led us to was a very structured process. So programs had to apply to become a Strengthening Families program. We required that 30% of their staff at all times were trained in Strengthening Families. We had them complete the self-assessment and do a plan and recomplete that at the end of our year. We provided mini grants, mainly to kind of see what would it take to put this on the ground. We provided monthly coaching for individual programs, and then we had a statewide learning network process. So we had a very structured approach with our early care and learning, and what we had kind of found out over the years is if you can go deep, it sticks a little more than if we go wide. Most recently, it's now been embedded. Alaska is just now launching our QRIS system, and Strengthening Families is now a portion of that. We also, in the beginning, were thinking about other systems and how we could embed this, and as the years went by, these last 10, 12 years went by, we have sort of launched into other systems. So, for example, Strengthening Families is embedded in some of our early childhood mental health grants, some of our child welfare grants, our Part C programs. We worked with the university to embed this in some of their coursework. We have now expanded out into working with some school districts. We developed a toolkit on community cafes in partnership with our domestic violence folks that went across the state. We did a series of community cafes with our Alaska Children's Trust, and so we have widened our reach through other systems. So the exciting news is what's happening now in fiscal year 15 through 17. So if I could have the next slide, Kaylin. In the first decade that we were working with Strengthening Families, we had very mixed funding, and it was very unreliable. So we would have, one year we'd have funding from our Alaska Children's Trust, one year we'd have funding from our maternal child health program. We, one year, received a great deal of money through our CHIP bonus funds that came back to the state, but we had no line item in our state budget. So for the first time in our state fiscal year 15, we received a line item for strengthening families in the state budget, which I might add is still there. But the caveat that came with that funding is we were asked to expand our work into western and northern Alaska. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we have fairly high rates of child abuse and neglect, in particular neglect in those areas. And there's also limited resources. So especially in our smaller communities, which of course are not connected by any kind of road system, social services and family support programs are pretty limited. So it seemed to be a good fit because, as we all know, strengthening families is pretty universal and can be shaped to the community that's using it. The other thing that happened in the last couple of years is we had a big initiative, and we're still working on this, to increase awareness about trauma and the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. And so it was a natural fit for strengthening families. Because of our work with early childhood, we were, of course, part of training on brain development and the impacts of ACEs on that. But also, the question that always comes up when we do those presentations is, but what can I do about it? And strengthening families was the perfect answer, what everyone could do if they wanted to address ACEs. And then most recently, Alaska has received one of the 10 Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems grants that was given out federally. And the goal of that is really to see developmental gains in young children. And the two mechanisms that Alaska has chosen to really focus on that is Strengthening Families and Help Me Grow program. So we're excited to be a part of that grant. So the next slide, I wanted to show you just a couple examples of some of the ACE data that we're using. And so again, often when there's an ACE presentation, the follow-up will be strengthening families is one of the things you can be doing. But we also use the ACE data in our presentations to sort of motivate and get people's attention. And we have hundreds of slides in how our adverse childhood experiences study has played out in Alaska. But I just wanted to show you one that I thought was pretty interesting, and I won't really go into detail about this other than to say that this slide shows the relationship between different adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to pick on domestic violence, and if you see that halfway down, and then you move to the middle of the page, you can see that 18.2% of the folks in Alaska who were surveyed said they experienced that before the age of 18. But if you look also across there, what it demonstrates is that if you look just to the left of that black box, 70% of folks who experienced domestic violence also had substance abuse in their household. 42% of them, there was mental illness in their household. And so what this chart shows is the relationship. And the way we use this slide is really to call people's attention to the fact that if you're supporting somebody or dealing with one issue, you should probably be talking about other issues because they're very related. The next slide is to show you what we have done with our Alaska Native information that we have. So we were able to subtract that from our ACE data, and then it's divided by behavioral health regions. And we're able to show how many of those regions reported 0 ACEs, 1 ACE, 2 to 3 ACEs, or 4+. And so it's been one way for regions to look at their ACE data, and it's one way for us to look at some of the assumptions we make about where people live and what their ACE scores might be. So we have a lot of ACE data, and we use that, but we are very careful with that because one of the things that we've heard frequently from our Alaska Native population is we hear a lot about things that aren't going well. We hear a lot about some of our statistics and our numbers, but we don't hear a lot about our strengths. So we tend not to dwell on this. It's kind of like we use it for motivation, and then we move on. It's good to recognize it, though, because as you know, when you're doing strengthening families training, lots of stories come out and people are talking about this, and they're really hoping to have more talking in order to heal some of the past wounds. So next slide is just kind of a map if you want to see where we're working in Alaska. As you know, we're a huge state, so I used to always tell people if my central office was in Chicago, I might have a program in Florida. And that gives you some idea of our geographical breadth here. But we do have 225 communities. Most of them are very small. Most of them are not on a road system. We do a lot of work long distance. We have many services that are delivered by itinerant folks, and we have several services that are delivered by paraprofessionals. For example, we have a paraprofessional dental aid program, so we have folks in the community that can do some of that work. We have behavioral health aides and community health aides in communities that go through training, but they are paraprofessionals. So services sometimes are very slim, and the folks in those positions tend to have sort of high-stress jobs. Number one, our communities are very small, and they often are related or know everyone in their community, and they're often out there by themselves. So we do see turnover in those positions, unfortunately. The next position gives you, slide, excuse me, shows you just some of our statistics. So in Alaska, 14.8% of our population are American Indian or Alaska Native. And so there's a huge presence in our state, and we're proud of the fact that our first Alaskans are really reviving their culture, and they're a very strong component of everything that we do here. Bethel is one of the regions that we're focusing on, particularly with our ECCS grant, and 82%, almost 83% of the population is Native there. We're also focusing out of the Nome region, and that's 75%. And then as we get into the Mat-Su Valley, which is just outside of Anchorage, a much smaller population. And we're also doing quite a bit of work in Kodiak out on the island. And it's a very diverse population in Kodiak. 13% are American Indian or Alaska Native. And this picture of these ladies here, they're one of our cohorts that we have done training with out of Nome, and a delightful group to work with. And you know, we learn so much when we go into our villages and our communities from the folks that are in our trainings. And these gals in particular had some very powerful personal stories to tell, and so much to say about resilience and coping and getting through everything from historical trauma to current day issues. They also have wonderful sense of humor, so our trainings are usually very fun. So I wanted to highlight on the next slide sort of what I have called our rural process. And you know, in some ways that's synonymous with what we're doing with our Alaska Native population, because almost everyone in rural Alaska was born there, are first Alaskans, and are native of Alaska Native descent. And so I wanted to highlight how we've sort of had to adjust our process. When we were working primarily in our urban centers and early care, we could just recruit programs and show up and say, here's a really good thing, you should try it. And we know that that's really an inappropriate way to approach it in our villages, in our smaller communities. So the first thing that we did is we hosted some community meetings. And that was really to bring community leaders and service providers together in those regions to say, here is something. Does strengthening families fit with your values and beliefs? Does it fit with what you're already doing? And if you're interested in this, who should we involve in the process? So it was really going out there to see if we would be or could be invited in. And we were very pleasantly surprised, not surprised, but very happy to hear from people that they thought it really was a good fit, and it really did line up with all the traditional values and beliefs, and really supported their work around their culture. But we felt like that community meeting was really important. And, you know, it was a great time also for us to hear from people about, here's what you need to tweak, here's what you need to do differently, here's what you need to do if you're going to approach this. So we got a lot of great advice from folks. What we did then is that we invited our villages to bring teams into community hubs for training. And we felt it was important that we had teams from communities because, again, if you're the only person in your community who's trying to launch this, it's very difficult. So if I'm the Head Start teacher, the community health aide, or behavioral health aide, it's really hard for me to do this on my own. But if I go back and if I have sort of a team, and we can make that team even bigger when we go back, it's more likely going to be successful. So we did. We invited teams. We had teams who applied to come in. And then we did the 2-day training, and we used the National Alliance of Children's Trust curriculum. Tammy's one of the certified trainers in that. And our trainings are always fun. I want to say the other thing that really works very well in our communities is festive decorations, a sense of humor, door prizes are critical, all of those things. So our trainings have really, we try to make them as welcoming and as informal and friendly as possible. We also offered to this initial group mini grants, so very small grants that communities could use to support some of their work. And more often than not, that was to buy food, supplies for community gatherings and parent gatherings. And then we asked for reports, of course, back on how they were using the mini grants. We did a round of visits to all the villages, and for us, again, that was very informative for us to be there. It was a way for us to really connect with a broader group from each community and really see what, you know, what were the big issues. For example, one of our communities is, because of climate change and the erosion and the huge storms we're having now in Alaska on the seacoast, their village needs protection because it's going to be washed away soon. So we were there when engineers came in and met with community people about how are we going to protect your village from storms, and just to be present in those meetings, you know, made us a familiar face to folks. We also decided that we would do end-of-the-year gatherings. So after people were in there initially for the training and we visited villages, we brought them in at the end of the year. And I have to say, the gatherings, people absolutely love to get together to talk about what they're doing in their communities around strengthening families. So that became a privilege and something that people really wanted to work toward. And then we developed some very specific materials, and Tammy's going to talk to you about that a little bit later, that were really very fitting for the regions that we were working with. So
before we move on,
yes.
Before we move on, this is Tammy Sandoval. Hello, everyone. I just want to point out in this picture, in particular, this is a village called, that's name is Gullivan. And in the winter, as you might imagine, this water, this body of water freezes over, and the eiditic rod crosses that body of water. And Shirley and I were lucky enough to be able to stay in this 2-story blue building on the right-hand side of the screen. That light pole, or that electric pole, those 2 windows were our bedrooms, and we would be able to see the sled dogs hit the ice, and it took them an hour to cross the ice. And so we would see them hit the ice and know an hour later We'd put on all of our gear, all of our winter gear, and go outside and watch the sled dogs go through this community. I just thought that I would add a little bit of Alaska knowledge to the conversation.
Well, and I have to say that was a great way to meet community folks too. You know, there was a very elderly woman who would show up every time a musher came into town, and to visit with her and find out I'm the mom of the behavioral health aide and I'm connected to so-and-so. It was just a great way to meet folks and to share in that sort of event. So it's been fun for us to travel, I have to tell you, out to these communities. Okay, I've lost my screen, Kaylin, so I'm just going to punt here. The next slide really has to do with fiscal year 17 and a little bit about how we've adjusted our process. Now that we are part of the Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems federal grant, what we're really doing is trying to focus our efforts in those communities. And so, again, this fall, what we did is went out and did another series of our 2-day trainings with all the partners that are going to support that grant. And one of the things that we're kind of excited about is through the ECCS grant, they have now hired point people in those regions. So there's going to be staff on the ground whose job it really is to help us support this implementation of strengthening families. And it's great because if you have somebody local who's respected in their community, you know, they can do things that we just can't do. So that's pretty exciting for us. And then the other thing that we'll be starting soon are learning networks, which will be these regular monthly calls. And people have told us what they'd like to do is hear more about protective factors, have speakers, and then share what they're doing from community to community, because they get great ideas from each other. So that's going to be starting up here in March. The next slide is really, I just wanted to show you some of the other systems that we're going through that is going to help us reach our Alaska Native population. And so, as I mentioned before, Help Me Grow is one of the other main mechanisms for the ECCS grant. And Help Me Grow will include strengthening families as part of what they're doing. We've also developed a toolkit, a Strengthening Families toolkit for primary care providers. And I'll be doing a training on that in Juneau today, but if our primary care people can also understand the language of strengthening families and participate in that, that will reach more of our population. This fall, we did a training with 30 behavioral health aides who were in Anchorage for their annual forum. So we have behavioral health aides that now have the language and will join us on the learning network. And one of the other systems that I neglected to put on the site is our Head Start programs, and some of our Parents as Teachers programs have also had training. And so the idea that we're hoping for is if you're in a community and your Head Start teacher and your behavioral health aide and your primary care person and a school person all understand and have common language around strengthening families, they can support each other's work. So the take-home messages, you know, for us is really to have cultural humility, that when we go, we need to be aware of how much we don't know. And the other thing that I think is really true is how different each village that we go to is. So you may have a community that's just down the river from another one, and in terms of health, services, leadership, they can be very, very different. We try to honor tradition as much as possible. In our trainings, we will often ask if they would like to have a prayer and if somebody would like to offer that, because that's traditional for their meetings to do that. But we try to be aware of that and honor those traditions as much as possible. Elders, as you know, are very important, and we find if there's an elder in the room, you really want to offer that person as much time as they would like to give in terms of offering their advice or reflecting on training and stories. We've also found that it's been very important for us to acknowledge historical trauma, and that's kind of a place to start often, is because we have had a lot of historical trauma for our population, and often people want that to be acknowledged before we move into the possibilities. We try to use appropriate metaphors, so we talk a lot about mountains and rivers and fish and streams and subsistence and those kind of things in our examples. We allow time for storytelling because it is a storytelling population, and that's historically how information has been handed down. We really try to focus on the strengths and resilience that this population has demonstrated. They have heard for many, many years how bad things are, how high the statistics are in terms of social problems, and for people really to recognize and be validated for all the strength and resilience they have has been very important. We try to connect all of our work with the values and beliefs in the regions and really pull on our local leaders and local champions to help us with that. And, you know, if you don't have someone local who, again, is well respected in their community, it's pretty hard to make any progress. And then, as I mentioned before, we try to participate in community activities whenever we can, and that is very fun for us, and people really appreciate that we enjoy that. So I'm going to turn this over to Tammy to talk a little bit about some of our images and materials that we've developed, and comments, Tammy, on anything else that I've said.
Sure, thanks. So as Shirley said early on, we learned pretty quick because we had leaders and communities tell us that to bring in pamphlets and folders and binders that looked like the lower 48 wasn't going to work for them. They were very clear with us that we needed to appeal to the population in those communities, and that they would not be able to engage with us because they couldn't relate. And so thankfully, the first year that we had full funding, we were able to pull the group that had gone through the training and the mini grants that had gone to particular villages. We were able to pull them all together. We traveled them in to Anchorage, which is a big deal for them, and we catered lunch, and we ran the day in a focus group kind of way, wherein we asked them, now that you've had the chance to work with these protective factors, what do they look like? What do they mean? How do you describe them to others in your community who haven't gone through training, who haven't got the definitions of what concrete supports in times of need means? And so in the next slide, what happened is that we brought them together and we asked them specific focus group questions about what each of the 5 protective factors meant to them. What do they look like? How do they play themselves out? Because the way that Shirley and I, in our culture, the way they play themselves out looks very different. And so it was amazing to see them come alive at just being asked that in and of itself. And so this, the next slide is the one that we used, what do strong families look like, to just define the 5 protective factors in and of themselves. Caitlin. So that is just the definitions, the ones that we are all accustomed to. And then we moved into the individual protective factors. And so on the next slide, you'll see we put the protective factor as we know it, but then we asked them, what does that mean to you? And they gave us lists and lists of what it looks like. And because we had 5 separate villages there, they were different from village to village. And so what we did was we just brainstormed and listened to what they said, and then we then went through an elimination process that those villages that were there could agree to. And that's what you see in the circle, or just outside of the circle. Teach children right from wrong, always provide unconditional love, help children learn, let children know that you're there for them, and spend time playing with children. So those were words that had meaning for them in their culture and in the locations that they're at in Alaska. Then we asked them to choose pictures that represent that sentiment, that intention. And for those of you who might not know, muskox are a big deal in Alaska, and they're known for being very protective of their young. And so that's a picture of muskox on knowledge, parenting, and child development. Concrete supports in times of need. Again, you can read the words that they used to explain it, but it meant that everybody goes out whaling together, that they get in the boat that they have designed, that they have built together as a community, and that they go out and they whale together. In the next slide, you'll see parental resilience. Again, salmon swimming upstream. If that's not resilience, I don't know what is. And while salmon swimming upstream isn't representative in the entire state of Alaska, it has meaning for everyone because salmon is a big deal. And everyone knows the struggle that salmon go through in order to make it upstream, and so that represented resilience. Social connections in that part of the state. Blanket toss is an event that people, when they're in celebration, when they come together to celebrate, that they have a blanket toss. And so that's our picture of that, social connections. And lastly, social and emotional competence of children. Again, around that circle, you'll see the words and the meaning that that they have for what it means to have your children be socially and emotionally competent. And of course, the picture is just beautiful of kids having fun, healthy kids playing with their dog. And so while we don't have them all represented here, what happened is that we, with the year-end money, we ordered a bunch of these posters, and we handed them out to everybody in that region that we had been working with. And of course, people, they started making their way to other parts of the region, but folks were clear with us that these pictures don't represent our community, don't represent our region. And while the words all made sense to them, and they were fine with leaving the descriptions of each of the 5 protective factors, but they wanted us to make changes in the photos. And so the next year-end money, that's what we did. They're not represented here, but if anybody wanted to see those, they're just different pictures. Everything else is the same. They're pictures that are representative of their communities. And so we now have 4 sets of these posters that are for the different parts of Alaska. The biggest news for me that I'm happy to be a part of, while being a part of Strengthening Families is enough, I have been in child welfare for my entire career. And when I worked in child welfare in Alaska, Shirley tugged on me and kept telling me about Strengthening Families, because if you're in child welfare, as you well know, you get involved with the family after the phone is already rang. And so she kept telling me about prevention, and it's not something that we spend a lot of time in, working on and thinking about in child welfare. And so once she pulled me along and I joined the Strengthening Families team, I then left OCS, the Child Welfare Agency, and became the director of the training arm of child welfare. And so as I got deeper and deeper involved in Strengthening Families and protective factors and understanding what it all meant, I, along with others, convinced the OCS, the Child Welfare Agency in Alaska, to use protective factors to case plan. And it was thankfully right at the same time as the materials from CSSP came out with regard to child welfare. And so I wasn't just speaking about it anymore. I actually had a hard copy of all of the ways that protective factors could be used in child welfare, and that was the defining moment. And so now in child welfare cases, families who it's determined that there are unsafe or high-risk children and who move on to the family services part of the agency, opened up for long-term services. We are now using the 5 protective factors to build them and write case plans around building those 5 protective factors, which I just am thrilled about. It's kept me in child welfare another 5 years longer than I really wanted to stay. So the next slide is just all of the folks who are involved in strengthening families, the leads, if you will. Jennifer, we still, unfortunately, call her the old Shirley. Jennifer took Shirley's place at the state. Then there's me. My email address has changed. It's tksandoval@alaska.edu. So if you would want to know anything about child welfare in that transition, along with anything else, I'd be happy to talk with whoever might want to have that conversation. And then, of course, there's Shirley's information.
All right. Thank you.
So any questions or comments? I mean, none came in while we were speaking, but anything left over?
Yes, I actually got one question that I can see on my email. So let me read that off to you. We are multi-screening here. So this is a question actually from one of my colleagues at CSSP. Gail Samuels asked, I'm struck by the implementation process for bringing strengthening families to rural areas versus what sounds like a more top-down approach in the non-rural areas where you started. So my question is, could the same approach or same principles work in non-rural areas? My guess is the families served in the non-rural areas were primarily made up of families within 2 generations from those rural areas. So do you have a thought about whether these kind of strategies would have worked in Anchorage or Juneau or the other towns?
Shirley, are you still with us?
I am, and I would say yes and no. I would say I think that's always a good process if you can, seek the invitation and the approval wherever you go. I think also for expediency in urban areas, it's like, here it is, come and get it if you're interested. And so, I think we always have to be welcoming. I think we always have to offer the invitation, and I think that process would work in urban areas also. I don't know, what do you think, Tammy?
Well, I was going to say yes and no as well. I think that the process would be successful if done that way. I think urban areas are where the hubs of state government are, the hubs and the leadership of the agencies that we work with, and it's not the way that they do business. And so I think that the reason why it's more top-down is because that's the way it's always been done. And if we were to try to go about it in the way that we've done it in rural, it would take a lot of effort because people aren't willing to let go of that authority, of that power, of the way that it's always been done. They need to approve it before it moves down. I mean, while I think it could work, I think we haven't done it that way because it's not what's traditional in the urban areas of the state.
And I think that maybe the exception, too, is with our tribal organizations that are in urban areas. And I'm thinking of training that Tammy has done with the Cook Inlet Tribal Corporation, and that was by invitation. And so I think within the urban, if we go straight to our tribal organizations, because we do have those in urban areas, you know, that again is a process I think would work for them. When we talk about state government and maybe some of our other service streams, the other way.
Right. We've got two other questions that have come in, and so I know we need to wrap up soon for this part and get to the updates from the Alliance, but I wanted to share these two questions. One, Debbie Peterson asked whether you have any links to Youth Thrive within that work, whether in the communities or in your child welfare implementation. Are you focusing on Youth Thrive and adolescent protective factors as well?
You know, it's great that you asked that. Shirley just referred to Cook Inlet Tribal Council is an agency that works with Alaska Native folks, and they're not a tribe, but rather an agency that serves families. They have invited me to do Strengthening Families, and I've added Youth Thrive specifically because they have a unit of staff who serve youth. And so when there's a natural place for it, we've added it where we can.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And then we have one final question from Roger Sherman in Idaho. He says, and I will read this word for word, I know that your primary issue in Alaska is grizzly bears in schools, but my question really is, how do you connect historical trauma and ACEs?
I mean, Shirley might answer this differently. What I would say, in short, is that we let the community help define it. Sometimes we go into communities that are fully aware of the ACE study and what it all means, and they have already crossed that bridge about acknowledging it and talking about it, and so that's easier to do. In some communities, when we ask the question about have you heard of the ACE study, nobody raises their hand. So it really depends on the group that we're speaking to. When we trained the behavioral health aides, it was a big topic of conversation. So it really depends on the group.
Okay. Interesting. And then I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of how historical trauma might come through even in someone who doesn't have a high ACE score per se.
Yes, agreed.
Live in a community and a family that has that history.
Agreed.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both so much for sharing this information. It's been fabulous. I'm going to hand off now to some updates from the National Alliance, but if folks still have questions, you can type them in, and if we have a minute or two at the end, we can still get to them, or I can email them to Tammy and Shirley afterwards. So thanks again to Tammy and Shirley, and now I'm going to hand it over to Meryl Levine from the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds.
Well, thank you, Kaylin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound.
Okay, great. I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you for having us. I also want to say, wow, what a great presentation and a hard act to follow between Tammy and Shirley. Just really, really a wealth of wonderful information. I just want to highlight for everyone, I think you, through our continuous updates that we've been doing, we've been highlighting a lot of the work that the Alliance has been doing with the Birth Parent National Network. And this is a network of parents from all across the country that are involved in helping to improve policy and practice that impacts children and families. And it runs across the continuum from improvement of prevention services all the way to the other end of the spectrum, like what Tammy was sharing in terms of child welfare as well. So what we are doing right now, and just what I wanted to kind of share with you is, in 2016, we had facilitated the Birth Parent National Network and the Alliance worked together, and we created what we called structured conversations, and we gathered a lot of data from parents around prevention and early intervention situations, as well as how parents, what they had to say in terms of prevention and early intervention, and also what they had to say about substance abuse related types of issues, because again, Tammy and Shirley were talking about the ACEs and how that also impacts families so critically. And as a result of that data, we pulled together 2 new issue briefs, and they are available for download right now at our Birth Parent National Network website that you can see right here up on the screen. But those particular briefs really highlighted current conditions in terms of what's happening right now, what families see as the current conditions of prevention and early intervention resources that are available for families. And they talked about a lot of those kinds of resources in this first issue brief. They also talked about what it was that families also would need in terms of substance abuse recovery, just what the conditions were right now. So our next step is really to move into, and this is just kind of to show you what it looks like. We hope you'll take some time to take a look at them. This is the sample of the early intervention strategies. But both of these issue briefs really highlight the importance of the Strengthening Families Protective Factors. So I just wanted to make sure, and that seems to be a message that the parents seem to come back with over and over and over again in terms of the importance of building protective factors in families. So where we're going now, and what I really wanted to make sure you would all be aware of, is we do have a new survey. We're in the throes of now moving to the next step and creating another series of issue briefs, and we want to focus now and learn more about what works. And in addition to accessing that information from parents, we also want to get it from experts like you as professionals that are involved in the field. And so we're looking to gather data again on prevention and early intervention strategies that work, and substance abuse prevention types of recovery strategies too. So we would really appreciate it if you could make it possible to complete our survey. The link is up here, and we are hoping that based on the information that we do gather, we'll have a second series of issue briefs that we'll be able to produce by hopefully mid-year. So we really are hoping that you will take the time to fill out that survey. We could really use your expertise and feedback. And Caitlin, if you take it to the next slide, if anybody is interested in joining the Birth Parent National Network, if you know of parents who might be interested in getting involved in the network, here is the link in order to fill out an application. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Martha.
Thank you, Meryl. Hi, everyone. I just want to share with you about some new resources that the Alliance National Parent Partnership Council is creating. I know that they presented this back in June on this very call, and so I'm just showing this. You can go right through these, Kaylin, go to the next one, about the protective factors. And these are really pieces that take the everyday actions, and we're collecting information from parents all across the country about what those everyday actions look like. And so right now this one is already available, and this handout, along with the two that Meryl just shared, will be on the download with today's materials, and also you can download the Parental Resilience piece from the webinar today. Right now we're looking at the social connections, and each one of these everyday actions, the parents brainstormed questions that would help parents to share very concrete examples of each one of these everyday actions. And on the next slide you'll see the link, the survey link, and I hope that you will distribute this survey link to parents that you work with and any parent networks that you collaborate with, and share it on social media. We will get all of these back, and we will be processing them and using them to help to create this next piece on social connections. And then we are already starting on the next protective factor after that. So within this year we hope to complete all 5 protective factors with these same kinds of tool for parents to really think about exactly what are some concrete actions, what does it look like when these everyday actions are being put into place. And then on the flip side of that tool are some parent translations of the protective factors from all over the country. I think, is there anything else? Is there another slide? I couldn't remember. Oh, yes.
Got one more.
The upcoming training of trainers, and this information is here. If you have any interest in these, I hope that you will contact me, and I'll put you in position of all the information that you need to know to participate in these trainings. Again, I want to say to Tammy and Shirley how much I enjoyed your presentation today, and I love to hear about your work. It's so exciting and just shows what this work can do on the ground. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Martha, so much, and thanks again to Shirley and Tammy. I think you shared a lot of great information. I think a lot of people on the webinar got some ideas they can take home and think about, maybe even put into practice in their own work right away. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll talk again in a month. Have a great rest of your day.